thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America, and our guest today is the very incisive Jami Floyd, host of WNYC's All Things Considered, which can be heard from 4 to 8 p.m. live daily. Jami, thank you for being with us today. Whenever I think about those numbers, 4 hours of breaking news, thoughtful pieces, Culture. How do you prepare for a thing like that?
You read a lot. I start very early in the morning. So I'm up and I'm looking at the breaking news that really starts overnight.
Right.
And digesting. And, you know, by the time we get to air at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a lot of that news has changed. But it's really just absorbing what's happening in Washington, overseas, and right here in New York City. You know, really a critically important place to our culture and our economy. And I've been a news junkie since I was a kid. I listened to WNYC as a child. So I'm doing what I love. And it's such a critically important time.
It is.
I'm pleased to have this opportunity to keep people informed every day.
I know. Just a sampling of the kinds of things you talked about yesterday were, I mean, the breadth of it, which is the stunning thing, because, you know, as an old-time reporter, we'd get assigned one story, maybe two. You know, you do that, 2 minutes of that, and then you would go home. But to have 4 hours to talk about every single thing happening in the world.
Yeah, well, you know, we have reporters still who take a deep dive on their beat every day. But the purpose of All Things Considered is to help the listener consider all things that are happening, or as many things as we possibly can in that span of time. And I think we do a pretty good job of giving folks not just the news, but analysis of the news.
So hard to come by. So hard to come by these days. Neutral.
Neutral, you know. Right. And we try to be fair and as objective as possible, and to present both sides or all sides of the issues.
Right, a novelty in the world of information these days.
And sort of partisan bickering and bantering and divisiveness, if you will.
Right, so now you say that you listened to WNYC as a child.
I did.
Tell us where you grew up and your influences. We always start, place yourself in Black America.
I certainly will. I grew up in subsidized housing on the Lower East Side of New York City. And I call it the good old days of New York City. You know, you always hear that phrase, the bad old days, but it was gritty, it was grimy, it was tough, but it was a great place to grow up because, you know, as they say, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere.
Yeah, the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
And subsidized housing.
And it was so diverse. I mean, I had friends and neighbors of every religion, of every race, of every class background, although the Lower East Side, it was a lower income neighborhood.
Then, but certainly not now.
Certainly not now, but still, I go visit my mother regularly, several times a week still.
Yeah.
And there are still NYCHA houses there. There are still Mitchell-Lama houses. Mm-hmm. Those are still there. And so it's still a mixed income neighborhood, although, as you say, there has been a lot of development. And with that, the battle over affordable housing in the neighborhood. But people live together in that high density space, I think, very well, considering now that you have the class conflict, as well as, I'm going to admit, we always had some ethnic and racial conflict down on the Lower East Side and here in New York City.
Yeah, and how did you fit into that, being a mixed race? I mean, we were talking earlier about all of these various definitions. You know, how do you define yourself?
Well, I define myself as Black, and I always have.
Right.
This is America, to borrow a phrase. And certainly in the 1960s, if you were part Black, you were Black.
Right.
And my mother and father chose to live in a neighborhood that was, I mean, it was multiracial, but it was very much a brown neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I saw myself, and still do see myself, as a Black woman in America. It was not easy to be a multiracial person in America, or to be a Black girl, even in New York City at that time. Mm-hmm. We think of New York City as such a progressive and accepting place. But even here, even then, in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of race tension. And if you go back through news clips and newspapers, you'll come across the Bernie Getz case or the Howard Beach case. I mean, we always had once a decade some explosive
those big
bubbling
stories.
over.
But what was the internal conversation, in your family? Because you could have made a choice,
We were a race family. My father was what we called then a race man.
Right. Oh, well, that's a term.
That's a term, right? My parents were very active in the civil rights movement. My father was arrested many times in integration protests. Back in Chicago, they had met in Chicago. And they were a very political family. We were a political family. And so we talked all the time about race. We were race conscious. And so the internal conversation in the family and in my own psyche was very much to be about race and race politics. And my motivation in my life and in my work has been to work on the race conflict in this country, to try and help resolve it. I think it's, we always call it the original sin in this country, slavery. And it's unresolved. We don't talk about it. We don't converse about it enough. We don't have enough programs like this one where we talk about Black America, Black contributions, and where we embrace them and celebrate our contributions to this great country. And also tackle that original sin and the legacy of it. And until we do that, we're not going to move forward. We're not post-racial.
Of course not.
Of course not.
I always give a little chuckle when I hear that, post-racial, when it's all about. You're working on, I want to talk about All Things Considered and your great journalistic life as well, but you're working on a project I'm very interested in where you're dealing with this issue of mixed race people. Talk a little bit about that.
It's called the Other Box Project, and the Other Box refers to the box that so many of us who are multiracial choose to check if given that categorization on census forms, on insurance forms when applying to colleges and universities, Black, white, it used to say Indian, Native American, or other. And recently Hispanic has been added. Believe it or not, those are the choices until very, very recently, 2010. Now, the Office of Management and Budget, which administers the census, is talking about adding multiracial. And if you look at the census forms over the years, and you can go on the internet and see them, it's so fascinating. It's such a reflection of who we have been as a culture. And do you know that once upon a time, and not so long ago, you didn't fill out the census yourself? Someone would come to the door, knock on the door, open the door, look at you, and they would decide whether you were Black, white, or other.
Yeah, I think some of our birth certificates have some pretty strange,
indeed,
identifiers on them. Right, precisely.
So this project is asking Americans to participate and think about who we are as a culture, especially those of us who are African American, and how we define ourselves and why, and how that's changed over the course of, we're looking at pretty much the last 50 years since the Loving decision, which declared laws against interracial marriage unconstitutional. And those laws were in place as recently as 50 years ago.
Sure.
And the Lovings,
aptly named,
were the couple that sued for the right to marry because they couldn't marry.
So it's fascinating. You were telling me that Carrie Mae Weems is your photographer.
Yes, very, as we know,
that's a pretty good get.
She's very politically active with her art and with her videography. And she's very much interested in this project. And so we started out with a series of public conversations over the course of a year, and the next phase is the artistic phase. Okay, so now let's get back. I'm eagerly awaiting the next phase of that, as we discussed, right? It's great. I want to talk to you about your background, which is, you're a lawyer from a very fancy law school, so tell us how you got to journalism. Right. Well, it's an easy answer, and it's perfect for this show.
Yes.
So I went to law school because I was inspired by Thurgood Marshall and seeing Thurgood Marshall and his colleagues, Constance Baker Motley, on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court, fighting for my right to go to school with all those other children to have an equal education, for my right to eat in the same restaurants and hotels.
I can see you as a little girl growing up in this family, looking at those pictures.
Right.
I actually see it. Yeah.
And my dad actually had a cutout of that photograph from a newspaper on his, he was a draftsman, and he had a bulletin board, and he had that photograph, and I would see it every day. So this inspired me to go to law school. But then I also was a news junkie.
Right.
And I would see the images of our people on the news every night, of mostly black men, always associated with crime and violence, never celebrated in the news and also in the popular media. And so I became a journalist because I wanted to do something to recalibrate the way we are represented in journalism, in news, and in the larger mass media. It was that simple. And I felt my reason for going to law school was about justice.
Sure.
But I felt that the way we tell our stories has such an impact on the way Americans think about African Americans, about African American stories, about our contribution to this great country, our contribution to the history, the way history is told, just the word history,
Sure.
all of that. Journalists are writing the first draft of history. And so I decided that I could have a greater impact as a journalist than I was having as a lawyer. Even though I was on the front lines every day, I was only speaking to 12 jurors at a time. And you can speak to maybe 12 million people at a time.
And you
with a
did
good
that
story.
when you were working for CBS News and all. But, you know, one of the big stories that you covered was the O.J. Simpson story. So there you are.
Yeah, that was my first big story.
Yeah.
And I actually got into that story because here you had an African-American man, beloved. I mean, we have to cast our minds back to what it was when it happened.
Sure. He was running through the airport. He was a darling of...
He was a darling of everyone,
Right.
And he was charged with this brutal murder. He was married to a white woman, as was my father. My father had played football, as did O.J. Simpson. So I associated so much.
Sure.
And there was also a domestic violence component, which wasn't being talked about. And I saw that all the analysts initially were white men of the case.
Right.
And so I wrote a letter suggesting that maybe they needed some female analysts and maybe they needed some African-American analysts. And that's how I essentially fell into, I was invited to become an analyst.
Right, you had your law degree, so you had your credentials and you had a perfect way of, and now we were talking in the green room about your experience at the White House as
that came first,
right,
actually. And I did a lot of crime and justice work there, community empowerment.
You were a White House fellow in the Clinton administration.
Indeed, and I worked both for Al Gore and for Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Two potential presidents
right,
back in the day.
Right. Did you feel that then? Did you know that about both of them?
I knew that for sure about Al Gore.
Right.
I had no idea we'd head into that Bush v. Gore Chad County.
Oh my goodness. Florida again.
Again.
Right.
Another huge story.
Right.
I mean, who could foresee that?
Right.
And with Hillary Clinton, I mean, I will say this about Hillary Clinton and Al Gore both. And I've met so many, as have you, brilliant people in my life, but these are two of the smartest people I've ever met. I mean, incredible.
Right.
I mean, big brains, big hearts, really trying to do good things for the world. Whatever you may think of their politics, these are people who've lived lives of service.
Yeah, I agree. It's so Hillary, you still in contact?
I didn't see at the time that she was going to run for president.
Right.
This was 25 years ago that I was working for her. But had someone said to me, do you think she could run for president? I would have said yes.
And now you were just having a conversation with your colleagues, people your age, trying to imagine when there would be a woman president. And I was so interested, you said you gave yourselves a 50-year time.
And you were surprised.
And I'm like, what? Please.
Well, you know, don't go by what I say, because I also said that we would never have a black president in my lifetime, and I was so wrong. And I'm so grateful that my father lived to see that.
That must have been
Oh
something
my
for
gosh.
him. Something.
Oh, his heart welled up.
But a little dismayed that with everything that we've seen lately, that you are saying now, maybe 50, within the next 50 years.
Well, I was one of the ones who said maybe not. I just think that the misogyny in this country, that it's fascinating to me that even countries that are so regressive on women's rights have had women leaders.
Right.
I'm thinking of Pakistan.
Sure.
Even in India, which is not as regressive, but and we were celebrating in the green room. I do want to be somewhat positive. The powerful women leaders we have had.
Right.
I mean, we have a Speaker of the House.
Pelosi, Nancy
we will
Pelosi.
likely have a Speaker of the House who's a woman. We have Dianne Feinstein. And Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and she was the third female Secretary of State, because we've had 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, in Condoleezza Rice, who was a powerful, big-brained woman, who I also know.
Right.
And so these are powerful women, and then you look overseas, and we have Theresa May, and we have Angela Merkel, and so progress is being made for women.
But you don't see it here.
Well, I think it's very difficult for Americans to step into the ballot box and give that kind of power to a woman. And here's the fascinating thing. I think women have a hard time believing in women.
Well, we have it in Georgia, which there may have been several things, race and gender operative there, where 76% of the white women there at least voted for Kemp, and Stacey Abrams lost by a very narrow margin. So
it's hard for a woman in our culture to be both strong and appealing, to be both intelligent and soft. Does a woman cry or does she not cry? Does she have a strong will or is she affectionate? I mean, men don't have to have all of these calculations. And then there's the physical appearance issue.
Right.
If she's too attractive, that's a negative. If she's not attractive enough, that's a negative. So I don't know that other cultures have this same consternation around femininity and leadership that we have.
I thought Nancy Pelosi did a very good job in her conference with the president and Schumer.
Oh my gosh, that was something.
she came across as and she said it in such a matter-of-fact way. Wait just a minute, so please do not diminish the fact that I am the leader of, the Democrats who've won the House of Representatives. Interestingly, too, Nikki Haley, when she was accused of being mixed up, of getting confused, and she said very plainly, no, I was not confused.
Yes.
But
I should have mentioned Nikki Haley as another one of our women leaders who is showing that the times are changing for women. And she not only was in South Carolina, but recently
as the governor
and recently ambassador to the United Nations, and now is stepping off that stage, I think, in time to preserve her integrity and to preserve the possibility of a run, perhaps, for the White House or for something else.
Right. So, so we have it there. What about Kamala Harris? Just a quick question.
Yes. Now, I don't know her personally, though I don't come from California, but I spent many years in California, both as a journalist and in law school. She is so well regarded in California and so very impressive, I think. And I think she has that balance. She has that mix. She's tough without being strident. A word that seems to be used more about women than about men, and super intellectual, without being self-important, or she takes the world seriously without taking herself seriously, or so it seems. Again, I don't know her. So she has the right balance, but then again, we have she has the extra layer of race.
Right. Right.
And then, of course, there's Cory Booker, speaking of race, and the Senate,
who
seems to be looking at a run. So it's an exciting time. I think
You're
it's
excited,
right? Well, I try to view the world with optimism.
Right.
Realism and optimism.
Great. I love that mix, realism and optimism.
Yeah. We have to be optimistic and realistic, not cynicism.
I want to talk before we leave about your January 20th event.
Speaking of optimism.
Optimism, right, that you're doing with Brian Lehrer.
Yes,
part
the
of our
MLK.
family here at CUNY. Right. So
Yes.
talk to us about who's
Well, this
coming
is our
and what-
13th annual event. This is at the Apollo. There are partners in this event now. It's exploded. I mean, we have 1,500 people in the audience, and we still have people who want to get in, and we therefore air it on Monday. So you can get tickets starting in January, and we will have that information on our website at wnyc.org. But if you don't manage to join us at the Apollo Live, Brian Lehrer on his show the next morning beginning at 10 a.m. re-airs good portions of what we will do on the stage there. And we have Dr. Hazel Dukes is coming.
Great, friend of ours.
A friend of
Great.
yours.
Yeah.
And we just learned that Bishop Michael Curry is going to come.
Great.
And he is going to do part of the invocation. He, of course, was at the latest royal wedding. And he's written a new book. He's going to talk with us a bit about that. And you know what we do? We do a celebration of Dr. King. It's a very happy, optimistic, celebratory day. And it's the Sunday before the MLK holiday, so that people who want to be reverential on Monday or do service work on Monday can do that. And we do it late in the day so that those who want to go to church on Sunday morning can go to church and then join us at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Well, it gets rave reviews. I was so disappointed I couldn't go last year.
Well, come this year.
I will definitely be
And
there.
we
January
do three
20th.
things. January 20th,
Right.
we do one conversation about the past, looking back to the heroes of the movement. Then we focus on the present, and then our last conversation looks ahead to the future. And we make it a point to include voices of all generations. The theme this year is the unsung heroes of the movement.
Mostly women.
Mostly women.
Mostly women.
But we're also going to talk about
You have Janet Deward-Bell, right, who is coming on to
do.
talk about the women of the civil rights movement.
the women of the civil rights movement, and we're going to talk about Bayard Rustin as
Ah,
well, who is often overlooked.
I know,
But we
he's
are
one of
going
my-
to focus on Constance Baker Motley and her role
Right.
in LDF, Legal Defense Fund.
Right, right.
So yes, so we are going to focus largely on the women, but we are going to speak of some other unsung heroes.
Well, Bayard Rustin, who was a master of mind, a genius, who because of his gayness was excluded, and often excluded from meetings and from the publicity and all of that, but who was
Yes, indeed. And,
extraordinary.
And very much a creative force behind the March on Washington.
Right.
And so many other important moments
Right.
of the
Well, it's such good work, I want to ask you also, before we're out of time too, because we always ask our guests to finish the statement on the power, the strength of Black America and what you perceive that to be.
Well, Black Americans, African Americans, Black Americans built this country. And we are rooted here. And it gets back to my optimism. I think this moment provides us an opportunity to recognize our power as a people and to look not just to the past and the present, but to the future that we have if we participate, if we organize, and if we think about our strength as an organized people. I think that too often we become discouraged, and it's so easy to become discouraged when we see the violence against Black men and women at the hands of police and others, when we see the statistics about education and health. But we should see those, I believe, as motivation to do more as a people together, not be discouraged, but to organize as they did in the 1960s and the 1970s. I think that we have leaders in our midst, perhaps even in the next generation, and we simply have to identify those leaders and find strength in our optimism and see this moment as an opportunity to move forward rather than to be mired in discouragement and cynicism.
Well, I thank you for that, Jami. I'm so glad that you were there to analyze the world for us. The work that you do is just incredible and absolutely essential. So
it is, and I worry, since we do 4 hours every day of what can be heavy news. I worry that not just for African Americans, but that for all Americans, it can feel burdensome. But I, again, hope that it serves to lift people into a place of action.
Okay, well, I think if they're listening every day from 4 to 8, I'm still astonished. Thank you so much, Jami Floyd, for being with us today.
It's such a pleasure and an honor. Thank you for
Love
having
your
me.
insight and the work that you're doing. The host of All Things Considered on WNYC from 4 to 8 p.m. And thanks to you all out there for joining us as well. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America, and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you.